So yeah, I'd like to thank Scott and Andrea for having me. Today we're going to talk about design systems from 0 to 1 and how we can take and unify our interfaces, especially in apps that have been running a long time and may have many disparate systems going on. So real brief, I'm a designer, a sometimes developer, a musician, and a permaculturist. I live on a small farm here outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, with dairy cows and chickens, and hopefully none of them will interrupt this presentation. So let's start with what is a design system. Let's get the terms out of the way. So first off, a Figma library is not a design system. So why did I start off with this grenade when so many design systems are delivered with a Figma file? It's just an artifact. The Figma file is how we build things out, but it is not in and of itself the system. The design system is, in fact, a set of standards to manage design at scale. So we're going to reduce redundancy and create a shared language and visual consistency. And that's going to be across different pages and different channels. And then also you can think about different devices. So delivering from the web versus delivering on a mobile device or a tablet or even embedded systems. All of these things can be handled by your design system. And this is kind of a new thing, but it's been effectively growing out of various techniques and systems that started in the early 2010s. And people call them, style guides and things of that nature at that point. And they've now become this kind of codified thing that we're moving towards. Lots of places now have these, and you can see a lot of examples because many of these are being built in public, which is great. So Salesforce has Lightning. Apple's human interface guidelines have been around for decades and are pretty legendary in this space. And you've got the various things from Adobe and Nord, and you've also got things from government. The UK has a great design system. The US web design system, the US WDS, is also another great tool and great example of what you can get ideas from and how you could build things out. So why might you need one? Well, you don't. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. But in all seriousness, too often people dive right in and start building a design system from scratch. And then they end up with a bigger mess than they started with. So what you want to do is look at what you're trying to solve here. What is the likely pain point? There's really two big ones that we're gonna talk about. And those two pain points are consistency and efficiency. And these are the main reasons I like moving towards a design system. First, the interface of your application or suite of applications is all over the map, right? We've got no consistency. That's something we'd love to solve and make better. Secondly, implementing designs, if it's all one-off work or the UI engineering staff is constantly reinventing the wheel, that's a problem. Everything is pulled and created by hand over and over and over again. So these are two things that we can measure, which is great when we want to talk about the success of this project that we want to do, and that moving towards a design system can help realize. So the thing we have to think about too is that we're not just shipping a one-off piece. This is a product. This is a living product. And if you're not willing to have a product manager and a designer and an engineer that pretty much are dedicated to it, or at least have this as a large part of their responsibility, then you may not want to go full bore into a design system because it takes maintenance and it takes upkeep. But let's talk about what we would need to just kind of start on the path towards it, because at the end of the day, we're not going to flip the switch and suddenly everything's great, right? This is an ongoing process. We're fixing things all the time. We want to improve things. And so if tomorrow is better than today, we're going to call that a win. So we need to do discovery. We need to understand users, and we need to iteratively develop and ship as quickly as possible to get the feedback, just like we would do with any product. And part of this to think about is developer experience, right? So DX matters. This design system is a product for your internal developers to use. It should make the workflow easier, and it should result in less rework and more consistency in our shipped software. That means that the great thing here is that as the developers working on the products, and you have a lot of insight into your current pain points. So you're kind of making things better for yourselves, which is fun, right? So research, ship early, ship often. So where do we start? Let's talk discovery. Design principles. So before we start digging in the mess, well, most of us have been digging in the mess. That's why we're here, right? So before we start thinking about trying to actually implement things immediately, let's get up to the why. Let's go back up to a higher level. Why do we do what we do? What should drive our decisions? What is a quality level that we all agree on? An example that I've used from a car company may be safety first. So if you think about a lot of car UIs today, right? Everything's going into touch screens. Well, if you look at very complex interfaces where you have visual focus elsewhere, most of those interfaces are not touchscreen. Most of them are physical, grabbable toggles, switches, things of that nature, because you don't want to have to take your eye off the road, find what you're looking for, touch it, come back up. And in those 3 to 5 seconds now, what's happened in front of you? You don't know. So thinking about different kind of UI decisions and tool decisions, the switch may be a better thing than having this really fancy thing we've been seeing Apple show off where the whole thing is this wraparound touch UI. So that's a kind of a principle, like safety is more important than sexy UI. Some good examples of this. Etsy did a really long process on this. They created a working group and they did workshops and surveys, interviews, discussions. Now, most of us don't have the kind of, carte blanche or even time to go through and doing that, but we can kind of do this process in a kind of guerrilla fashion, talking to people over lunch, kind of just saying, hey, can we get on the phone real quick and show me what's going on with this? And then you can slip a couple other questions in. So if you look at who's going to, we've got all these kind of high level questions here, and you could straight up crib this and use it for your own purposes. What does design mean to us? Why? A lot of whys here. Who benefits? What are the characteristics? So some of those things like that. And Magera Moon was quoted on when talking about this, excellent design means unity. It's asking, does everything we do feel essential and work together to create a holistic experience? So this is the why, right? This will anchor the entire project. And this could feel navel gazing a little bit, especially if you're trying to just go fast. But if you don't have that good foundation, it's hard sometimes to make those decisions later. If you have that good foundation and something is questionable, you can always point back and say, hey, that breaks with what we had all agreed on back here on day one. So from there, we're going to look at 3 pieces, and some teams may just stop after they finish these 3 pieces, and that's awesome. It's going to be dramatically improved. We're going to get consistency, we're going to get brand consistency, we're going to get reuse. A lot of things happen with this without even going into a formal design system. So first up is the UI audit. And when I talk about UI audit, it's really about understanding what you have. The more products you have, the more tools or the more modules, sometimes depending on how the code was built out, you're going to have a lot of drift. You're going to have a lot of screens, and just literally without judgment, going through and capturing all of it and getting it into one source of truth is a great first step that you can take. So this was one I did recently on a relatively small product. But you can see there's a lot of screens. I broke this out kind of by module, and it's not every single screen represented here, but mostly the prototypical ones. So what happens when I click this and this modal comes up? Okay, I've got 4 of those modals. Great. Okay, now I can understand why is this modal in this module totally different than the one over here? How are we calling that? Let's go look in the code. Is it 2 different classes, 2 different style groups? What's going on? That's the kind of stuff we want to do at this point. And then you're going to start looking at the shared components. So let's just go through and we're going to cut and paste all of our buttons into one file. And this is a famous example of this. This is from PNC, and they had a lot of drift when they had done this. This is probably 10, 15 years ago now. But you'll notice all these different buttons, and this just shows you how many different teams were working on it and all the little things that got changed because somebody else came up with a new design and that shipped. But they didn't know that this team over here had a totally different color scheme happening. So it usually doesn't end up being this crazy anymore because we've all started moving towards it, but it's the bigger and the older the product you're working in, the more likely you are to end up with a button screen that looks like this, right? So in that screen grab that I just showed you with all the different screens, this was the button file. It's not dramatically bad, but there's a lot of minute differences here. Different size icons by a couple pixels, different size fonts, rounded corners versus not, outline versus not, just lots of different shades, some low contrast issues here with the orange on gray. The black on medium gray is effectively illegible as well. And lots of things. Is this a button? Is this a tag or a label? There were some issues there that we ran into as well. And some things with icons, some things without. From there, you want to also look at your brand standards. If you're working in a larger company, there often is a very well-defined marketing side, brand graphic standards. These go back, to time immemorial. I mean, I've got one up here on the wall here from the New York City Transit Authority when they actually did the design. There's an actual design system for every sign, every printed piece in the New York City subway, things like that. These have gone on for decades. This one here is from Nextel, and it's from 2004, but it's one of the most holistic style guides you'll ever see. It's I mean, look at those awesome flip phones. But besides that, think about it. The iPhone doesn't even exist when this thing comes out, right? So it's kind of a bit of a head twist. But these guys often cover do's and don'ts. They cover logo, they cover web, they cover print, they cover advertising, they cover packaging, and more. I mean, they really get explicit about how the brand should be used across the board. So our software needs to inherit from this. This is apparent. Can we use the print specified font? A lot of times we can't because of licensing. It can be really expensive if they came out and went with something from Linotype that's a really nice font, and you want to use it on the web and you're in a high traffic site. That's just a non-starter because of the licensing costs. So looking at maybe a free Google font that's very close, things like that. That's the kind of stuff that's part of the give and take here as we move the brand into the digital realm. Most of the guidelines these days actually specify you're a designer, you probably don't have access to our fonts, and then web use. And they've actually made those decisions for us, which is even better. You're also going to see that they're going to have defined colors. Usually they're going to reference Pantone, which is a print color scheme, but more often than not, they're going to provide CMYK, RGB, and hex values as well. What's great here is that you can just copy those in and make sure that they're right. And you can notice on this is a screen grab from a working file. All those hex values are the red. I had not finished this page when I screen captured it. So sometimes you'll have that if it's an in progress file. But this is not enough for us to build a website out of, right? We have a lot more things that we need. And so one thing I always start out with is working up a gray palette. And this may be a cool gray, it may be a warm gray, you may shift the color a little bit, but there's always some kind of lightweight palette that gives you definition of space on the screen. So, this is a sidebar and there's a little bit of a background color. There's a cool SAS math tool, so you can say, here's a gray that I like, and then you can have it work out the math going up and down. So here you'll notice this is darkening by 15, darkening by 25, darkening by 30, and lightening on the same. And then those I've gone up above, and this was for a Tailwind CSS project. And so we've actually assigned those to Tailwind values. And I've referenced what those Tailwind values are. And in my Figma file, these grays were named those values above. So that helps when I'm working with the developer on an implementation thing. I'm like, oh, we're going to use gray 300 here, not some esoteric hex value, right? Because we want to extract those things to names that there's a unified source. And if we need to change gray 300 for whatever reason, it's one change instead of thousands of changes. So some of the other stuff here too is like looking at your page frame and working through that. So when I worked at Procore in 2015, their initial page frame was effectively Basecamp 1. If you ever used Basecamp 1, those tabs on blue should look very familiar to you. It worked fine, but a lot of tabs, and they're totally unrelated to their brand. So their brand was very much grays and oranges, and it was a warm gray palette. So construction orange literally was their color. And so I brought Karen Owens in, and I think she's now the creative director or VP of creative there, but she was running the brand side, the primary brand designer, into the UX process to help us align. And so we kind of went through some processes and different revs and tried some different things out. And you'll notice a dramatic change by the time we get to the end where we've lightened up tremendously. And we're now looking at something that is very much on par with their brand. This is now 8 years old. And, after I left, the whole app changed dramatically again, too. So this looks nothing like it looks today, but you can kind of see how we went from V1 to V2 and to V3 there at the end where we deployed. Looking at this also is typography. So a lot of times you're going to have people have just defined font sizes all willy-nilly, and there's no unification. And what we want to do is think about this the same way we would think about a print document. So we're unifying fonts, we're standardizing sizes, and there's a hierarchy. So there's a headline, a subhead, right? So if you think, yeah, we have H1, H2, H3 going down in HTML tags, but the thing to think about is paragraph styles and character styles. So a paragraph style in a print file is an entire line or a block. And that style applies to all the text in that block. A character style can apply to 1 through n characters and is an override on the paragraph style. So we would usually think about that like bolding or italics in HTML is an easy way, but we also can achieve this with various other HTML tags. The most likely basic one is a span. But this could be used to achieve various effects while keeping things pretty clean. But you'll notice here we've got pretty clear hierarchy, right? We've got a headline, we've got a kind of a subhead in different places. Some of those are block cap. And then the ones that are file names or file descriptions are not. Those are done with title case. You've got like a breadcrumb that's all block cap at the top. You got the buttons are the same, right? So as you go through, there's a hierarchy here. And I know that when I build a new page, I don't have to go reinvent the wheel. I'm just pulling and I'm applying, and my style sheets are doing a lot of the heavy lift here. Something else that's a great thing to do at this point is to look for the best font family. Sometimes it's unrelated to the print world. For example, this is a font that was released a little while ago. This is from airplane cockpits. If you are using something that's a high stress, high contrast area and you need legibility, this might be something you'd want to look at. Look at how your app's being used, what people are doing what, and is there a way to change fonts or bring new fonts in that will help you improve the overall experience. So looking now at existing components. If you're already working in a component system like React, you may or may not have something to work with. So you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater when you're going through this process, but take stock of your existing system and figure out where things are and aren't working. If you've got design staff, talk to the designers and see what the current state is. Are they looking to move to new design ideas in the future? And how does that happen? And once you have all these things, you can start moving on to standardizing things. And there's kind of two kinds of components. There's components which end up tending to be larger pieces. And then there's micro components about this too. And these could be button. It could be something just as simple as the icon and how icons are used and what those sizes are. Form element. This is an input. This is a select. Now we can talk about the macro components where I start combining multiple buttons together into a certain kind of lockup. Or I'm going to combine certain buttons to get certain form fields together for this kind of thing. If it's a modal, the form should do this. If it's an inline, the form should do that. Trying to define those rules and almost define them in a way where you're thinking about like, yeah, here's implementations. Now let's standardize those to one and push it out and see how it looks. And this is stuff you don't have to deploy this to the customer. You can just run this in development and kind of play with it and see how it feels. A lot of this can be achieved just using global CSS definitions and coming and extracting those out. So I worked on a React app over a year ago, but everything was redefined repeatedly. So there was a lot of replicated code, and each piece of that replicated code had drifted a little bit from each other. So it wasn't like somebody had named something else or added an element in and then changed the way the nesting was handled. So it made it really hard to reskin it because half of the time I was literally looking through the app trying to extract this one element that had become 7 and bring it back to 1. So for example, like a card and the way the cards were done, there was just copied and pasted over and over again. So look at commonality and use inheritance. With the card example, do they all have the same rounded corner in the drop shadow? Okay, cool. That's easy. That's a generic. But if you've got one that's a square card and one that's rounded and one that's, maybe they've done something funky with an image bevel and they've cut off a corner only to make it look futuristic, you're going to have a little more work to kind of bring those all together. But there's also variations on the theme. You have a card. Does that card have an image? It may or may not. Does the card have an action button on it? It may or may not. But you want to be able to extract things up to the parent whenever possible. So when you make that parent change, all the children get updated. But you don't want to break the children in the process, right? So this is kind of like, this is where the real work is starting to happen here. And this is a great time to go through and look at accessibility. So using Stark or the WCAG testing tools, go through and make sure that you've got all the right contrast ratios for at least AA, and move your stuff forward to be accessible. You're going to make the wins on accessibility at the small level, and not by doing a whole accessibility audit project in its own. Like every single micro component, if that's made accessible, you're 80% of the way there. So here's a button. This is all the different states of the button. So the top is the base state. You got primary on the left, secondary on the right. You've got with a label and without a label. So you've got the primary base state. Then the second level down is you're going to have something that's a hover. The third is the click. The fourth is disabled. And the fifth is the tab focus. So what happens if I'm tabbing through? How do I know where my tab is? So having all those things defined, then we could apply that to the UI and see how does this work. And you come back, you're like, oh, that looks really big in this case. Do we need a large and a small button? And if so, then what does the small button look like? So starting off with defining all those states, making sure you've captured them all, and then you take them into like what I would call lockups. So this is an example of a header lockup. So on every page, there's a headline, there's a data filter, and there's an upload and a download component in this particular app. So this is, you can lock this in. This could become its own component, but it doesn't have to be. But that usually makes things easier and more consistent if you can bring in and get these lockups and these patterns ready to go. So how do we do this without trying to boil the ocean? One of the ways to think about this is atomic design. So Brad Frost popularized this almost a decade ago now, and it looks at web pages being built as atoms. Then groups of atoms become molecules, molecules become organisms, and then those can become templates and pages. And he has a long blog post on this, and he's done a lot of ongoing discussion about this, especially as design systems have come out and things have moved forward. So about a decade ago now, more than now, I was working at Living Social, and we had a majestic Ruby on Rails monolith that was originally built by a small team, and it turned into a 200-person engineering product org. And it went through a microservices kind of split. So we ended up with 4 silos, and each silo had multiple elements. So consumer, merchant, internal, and infrastructure. And we had a very busy R&D team to boot on top of that. So coming in, we doubled the team from 15 to 30 as part of an acqui-hire, and most of the visual brand was limited to the consumer-facing stuff. The internal tools was literally Rails scaffolding because it was a really fast-moving startup, and that worked. It was fine initially, but when a company goes from super small to super big, you start throwing people at bad interfaces instead of fixing the interface. So we got to a point where that pain was becoming too much. I was doing front-end work on the internal tools, trying to improve them, and at some point I basically broke down and came up and said, we need to redesign this. And so I made a bunch of vision boards, and these were just screens that I took various elements and said, hey, this could be cool. This is something where this is a messaging to stakeholders. So there was 5 different screens. We kind of shopped it around, got feedback, changed it up, and then we presented to the CTO, Aaron Battalion. Now, Aaron, if any of you know Aaron, he is not one to be short on words. He's very vocal, he has strong opinions, and is very quick to make a decision. And so I present this, and he doesn't say a word, which freaks me out, right? So he finally looks up and says, hey, this is 18 months of work. We're like, whoa, we're not pitching these screens today. We're saying, can we start this process? So we did. We started that, and we made something called Wild after Oscar Wilde, which was deployed as a Ruby gem. The consumer side, it was doing something in parallel that they called Stepford, because it was Stepford wives get replicated, right? Kind of fun naming, right? But for us internally, we wanted something that was very app. It was very much a tool as opposed to a purchasing e-commerce experience. So we were supporting all sorts of financial tools and things of that nature. So we built a page frame, and it was a responsive layout, had modals, and had elements that could be turned off and on with config. And this is this is a way to unify things through App Chrome. So just with this frame, even if the nest still had an old look and feel, it still felt like you were in a family of a tool. And nowadays, like back then, we were doing all sorts of basic CSS. Nowadays, you could do this very easily with CSS Grid and do some cool stuff. We also built in documentation. We pulled a lot of this stuff straight out of Bootstrap and then cut and moved pieces around to where we wanted it and made it all as CSS. So like these, you'll notice, look very similar, but then we derived things out of that and we changed up the microcopy specifically to be much more playful as an internal tool. So instead of just being, you have successfully created blah, 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 right? We gave a lot more personality to the app. And these are the kind of little decisions that you can make as a team as you're working on your projects and can really improve the tools. Again, these buttons should look familiar to anyone that used Bootstrap a decade ago. But we turn these into just, this is how we're going to use these, and making sure that the sizes and the class names worked well for what we were doing. We did not do the classes in the HTML. We named things and then we defined them in CSS. So there was a difference in application. But as we built this out, this came, like I said, it became into a Ruby gem, and this became the final, after many months of development and deployment work, for the customer service app. The customer service app started off as double entry into Salesforce and a Rails app. And we made it one shared screen that talked and got everything going. So they had, they'd look up a person, they'd get all their details up. And instead of going between systems, they had everything they needed to. And we were able to get good KPIs on this. And these UI changes, we didn't really change the functionality. We just made it streamlined. It went agent SLA from 20 to 95%. We decreased call abandonment rate from 20% to 4%. And we reduced the time to complete a consumer case, like somebody who was an e-commerce user called in with a complaint, by 20%. But we didn't do that in one fell swoop. So we started off by building pieces, shipping in part. At first, we went through and just added in a global search bar because people had to go up and go down and go here and go back. And instead, we just said, hey, here's a quick way to search. You can search by email, voucher, or purchase ID. Those were the three most likely ways we were going to get to find somebody. We then changed out the customer block. So we had an idea of who this customer was when they came in. A lot of times we'd have a couple bad actors, and those bad actors would have 20 purchases and 20 issues. That's somebody you want to be questioning. Is this actually an issue, or are they trying to take advantage of the system? A lot of people called in because a credit card expired. So giving easy access to changing credit cards or setting default or removing them from people's accounts. And you can kind of see some of these things were the old UI. So like merge and deal bucks and stuff like that. We didn't touch those yet at that point. And then having just a huge detail, we basically took these rows in purchase history and we gave a huge drop down that had the details, because there were so many deals that the customer support people didn't even know what the deal was. And so sometimes there was like, hey, what did it say? Especially with the fine print, like, hey, I tried to use this, but they said no. Well, did you go twice? Yeah, it's one time you sold. That's the kind of stuff that we were able to push forward. And then this got applied across to multiple different systems, right? Here's a sales system. This is actually something that we styled in Salesforce. We had two Apex developers working on this with Lynn Wallenstein, who was the CSS guru, and basically they were able to implement this inside Salesforce and skin Salesforce. And we had another app that was about scheduling, right? Still feels like the same family, but dramatically different. And so there was a lot of decisions that were made for them around the app frame, but then they could move things around and try new components here as we needed to move forward. And so some things like, for example, the little pop-up modal, when you hovered on an event, we use that in other places as well. So this system was built and expanded over 18 months. It responded to the need of the product, and we were testing it extensively as we went. It ended up being a Ruby gem and a Bower package, depending on the product, and we managed it as a product. So 2 designers and 2 front-end devs were supporting 30 apps across multiple tech stacks by the time I left the organization. So how do we level up? We've taken and made things into components. We've started fixing those and building them out through our system. We are well on our way, but now we can start moving this to another level. And this is where we actually get into what would be termed the design system. So the first thing you'll hear is tokens, and tokens is just a fancy way of saying variables. Back in the day, we did this with SCSS. We just named them, and then you can see we've got some SAS adjustment, functions in here too on the colors. But this is a really simple, basic way. Nowadays, you'll notice things like, for example, this is in material. Material has namespaced colors, and pretty much everything's been namespaced. But as long as you guys can agree on what to call them, it doesn't really matter how you want to namespace them. You just want to have the same kind of hierarchical structure. But you can sit there and call that color, and that is defined somewhere. And then when you see it in the UI across the board, it will all be the same pink in this case. A great example that can kind of help you break out of what tokens can do is this tool up on GitHub called Shaper. And this is just a playground. And so you can look at the different things. So there's a text increment, a base text size, the font itself, the spacing increment, the text frame, button proportion, the color hue, accent saturation, accent lightness, the gray saturation, and then the layer, like what's the radius, what's the field border, do I want rounded buttons or not, dark mode or not. And this is really fun to see how just standardizing all your spacing, for example, into a variable, and then using that globally, what that can do to a product. Yes, that takes a lot of time, but that's where you start getting the magic of dramatic changes very quickly. And you can serve tokens a couple different ways. The first, the easiest way is to start by having them just in the app itself. After that, you can look at something like JSON endpoints. So you just have an API somewhere that serves those tokens. And it can just be a standalone little microservice, or it can be something more complex. And then there's a ton of third-party tools, which we'll look at later, that will do this for you and actually make it part of the documentation of the design system, is not only the serving of these tokens, but the transformation of these tokens. So what do I mean by transformation? When I'm going to the web, it may be different than how I need to send that to Swift UI, or I need to send that to another, Android platform or whatever. So there's a way to say, here's my token that I call this. Now the transform tool is going to say, here it is in CSS, here's SCSS, here's Swift UI, here's this paradigm, here's whatever. And that there's different ways to do this. You can get a standalone system to do that transform for you, such as Salesforce's Theo, which they've released as an open source product. Or you can look at some of the other platforms that have that built in these days. So from here, you can kind of go haywire and just do all sorts of things. You've got content guidelines. You can start talking about the voice of the system. What is all the microcopy? MailChimp's a great example of a super personalized, playful microcopy application. If you're working on an industrial control system, maybe not the place to be really funny. I don't know, maybe the users will like it, but usually it shouldn't be something. There should be a level of match to what you're shipping. You want to bring in, you can bring in the brand guidelines and get those implemented. Sometimes if you're doing certain kinds of products, motion and video are very, very heavily used. And so having standards and examples of that is great. UI kits for Figma or Sketch or UXPin or any of these other products, where designers that are new coming in, they have a kit of parts that they can build new UIs with, so they're not reinventing the wheel as well. And then tutorials and documentation is always great and helpful for onboarding especially. And remember, this is ongoing product development. You have to keep doing it. You have to keep improving it, because otherwise it'll go stagnant, and then people will just say, I'm just going to fix this in my app, and you're back to where you started. So some of these other tools that I mentioned earlier, Storybook.js, if you're in React or any of those, that system in that kind of family, this is really great. You have the documentation, you've got the component, you've got a little bit of a playground built in. You can have one source of truth on what these things are and how they should be used. If you're not working in React, say you're working in something like Rails, there's Vue component, which is a kind of a component concept, or Flex is another new one that's come out, which extracts out the Vue concept and turns it into a component. So you can get the benefit of components without having to use a single page application kind of framework. Storybook doesn't play too nice with that, so you need to use something else like Lookbook. But these are kind of more developer side tools. In more holistic SaaS tools, there's about 5 or 6 of these that have come out in the last few years. And I'm going to just talk about them all real quick. Specify is one that's pretty well known. It's a documentation tool, handles distribution and handles translation. You've got Backlight, which is kind of a similar thing, a little more code driven, a little more developer focused. Supernova is, there's some nice things here with direct implementation from Figma. So you can update the named component in Figma and it feeds out to Supernova. It has some nice features like component status. So if you have a bug on this component, or this has become a deprecated component, you can actually see all that in their system. Again, it handles translation and transformation. Knapsack is another cool one. It's get back local or cloud. There's theme management in this. Again, automated transformation. It's all pretty similar across the board here. It's finding out which one works best for your team and will grow with you. And the last one that I was looking at recently is Zero Height. And this syncs with a lot of platforms. It's not just Figma locked. So if you're in Sketch or Adobe XD or one of those, this might be something that works better for your team. This also outbooks the storybook from here. And there are multiple published documentation endpoints, which is nice. There's some other stuff too that's kind of cool that you could use. This is a relatively new tool called Omelet. So it helps you understand which components are actually getting used in production. So do I have abandoned components? Well, you could go ask all the developers, or you could just get a report and see no one's using this. Why? Do we want to maintain it? And if not, well, let's get it out of there so we're not maintaining stuff that is never used. So we'll talk briefly about the state of the art. This is a rapidly changing space. There's new tools, there's new ideas popping up on a regular basis. But there's some cool things happening, and one of those is a W3C spec around design tokens. So as this is a draft specification, and so this could go on for a while, but people are starting to coalesce towards this in the sense of what they're going to do. Knapsack, for example, already supports this specification. So keep your eye on that, see how things are moving forward. There's some other tools to try out. Envision DSM, I'm not sure if this is deprecated or not. They've kind of pivoted hard to compete with Miro. And so with their freehand tools, so we use DSM for years at various places, but it seems to kind of be going on away. But it was another great tool that had a source of truth, had tokens, had translation, things like that. UX Pin is a cool thing that is, it's more about prototyping. It's kind of similar to Axure in that front, but it has some nice design tool stuff in it. Storybook and Lookbook, like we looked at. Pattern Lab is a cool site. You can get some ideas on various design patterns. And like all those SaaS platforms I kind of showed out, give those a whirl, see what's there. And as these things are being, launched and you've got a lot of competition, it's at least worth test driving almost all of this, because you're going to find something you're like, this really jives with how my mind works and what we're doing. And I think this is great. So your marching orders, work on those design principles up front, right? Have a good foundation, do your UI audit, bring in your marketing guides, get those locked in, make sure your brand of your product aligns with the brand of the company. Then work into your components, figure out what you have, figure out what you need, and then it's land and expand, and it's just treating it like a product. So you follow that, and you pretty much just kind of rev that over and over again, especially the last 4 there, and you'll end up moving your apps way down the road. If you're interested, I do have some other stuff about developer and developer user experience. This is a course I've taught in person that I'm turning into an online course. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, here are the details. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. I'll be around in here and then in the main room for an hour or 2 more. So I appreciate your all's time. Thank you.